Welcome to the British Museum of the 21st century.
I was left to my own devices. Many days fell away with nothing to show. And the walls got tumbled down in the city we love. Great clouds roll in the hills, leaning on the close your eyes,
Thank you for attention. And actually, I expected to have this music even louder. I wanted to surprise you and maybe to provoke some question. Why music and why the contemporary acoustic group? Why this context? Why YouTube? The answer is very simple, because it's the 21st century and the director of the British Museum invited quite a popular band, Bastille, to perform in their rooms, in their halls, exhibition halls, where they opened the blockbuster exhibition for Pompeii. And the band actually produced the video about this invitation to the museum halls. There was the individual tour with the director of the museum. Over 2 million views for this video. As a result, this is the non-conventional, non-standard, extraordinary advertisement at one of the oldest and for some people one of the dullest museums in the world, because this is not the Museum of Contemporary Art or something. And I believe it was also done to introduce you to the topic of this lecture. So what does the museum mean to us today? And I will try to use the next 40 minutes to tell you about the roles of museums in the history of society and what the phenomenon of the unprecedented museum boom in the 21st century is all about, in order to give you an impression about the scale of the popularity of museums in the recent years. For example, some of the US statistics. On average, 850 million people visit the museums in US. So this is even more than all of the sports events, the high league games, and also some of the attraction parks and arcades like Disneyland all together in total. All the same is happening all over the world in other places, and these are record-hitting numbers of visitors to museums or typical of different museums, but also there is the huge scale of the construction of new museums. They are opened in many different countries, including the countries like we actually know that I will go back to this map again and continue, but some of the highest numbers are typical of China. China actually introduced the plan for construction of the museums for the 5-year plan. That might sound very similar as a concept. And you can see this is the statistics for 2 years. In 2011 and 2012, they constructed about 1,000 of museums. I will get back to this global map. I hope you can see it. Please pay attention. It also includes Kyiv. I will tell you later why. And this is the result of efforts of The Economist magazine, and they paid attention to the situation with the museums in the world, they decided to investigate this deeper, and they published a series of materials about this phenomenon. They were trying to analyze the reasons, the indicators, and some of the possible consequences of the museum boom. What is more, why would we talk about museums so much today? Because today museums are an integral part and even the generator of social success and economic prosperity of cities and the entire regions. Never before have they invested so much into the museum area. Today, about 55,000 museums are available in the world. To compare, this is twice as more than 20 years ago. It is natural that you might ask the question, why? Why is it so? Because we do have many other opportunities for leisure time. We have the unlimited opportunities for communication on the internet, in social media, but nevertheless, museums are flourishing and prospering in this world. So I decided to present several of the typical answers to this question, and after this lecture I encourage you to share your opinions on that. So some of the reasons. In the 21st century, the world has accumulated the unprecedented financial wealth. It might sound paradoxical in the days when the world is not able to cope with the refugee problem and the mass hunger in Africa, but this is the fact. The world has never been so rich. In the historical perspective, as we might see, in the 19th century, every new stage of the financial wealth would promote the support of culture and arts and museums as a part of this. Philanthropists have always been ready, and they are ready today, and they are trying to share their wealth with the society in order to preserve due heritage and their name. The second reason, local authorities, municipal and regional authorities are interested in creating the landmarks, the magnets to attract more tourists, and the economic capacity of this tourist flow does not need further explanation. The globalization, the unprecedented development of the so-called cultural tourism, and the amounts that the tourists are bringing and living in these localities are taken by local authorities as the direct opportunity to fill the local budget. Today, the cities all over the world live through the Renaissance period. They are searching for new approaches, and they're competing for being the first in popularity. But museums are undoubtedly the new criteria of the city being modern and cultural. At the same time, the third reason, the urban planners and developers take new museums as the magic wand because it brings the social goods and wealth able to enliven the previously distressed and depressed city areas. The fourth reason, museums today are not the archaic institutions with the silence in the empty halls. The main function traditionally used to be to collect, to describe, and to exhibit the objects. Today, museums are dynamic places for social interactive communication. Contemporary audiences do have large appetites to modern cultural attractions, including museums. What is more, contemporary audiences, prospective audiences of the newly constructed museums, this is the state-of-the-art modern audience who have shaped and developed in the epoch of the so-called information economy. We can discuss this later in more detail. And the effect of this economy actually impacted all of the areas of modern society. The statistics claims that the visitors to museums are younger and more educated. They take museums as an attractive platform for social interaction and creative leisure time. But also museums are a great place for informal education, which is getting to be more and more wanted in the professional world. The museum experts were some of the first to appreciate the potential opportunities due to new technologies. In fact, the digital revolution that we have all faced in the early 21st century, whether we want it or not, whether we admit it or not, but today we are all a part and we are all engaged of the rapidly developing industries of mass information and communication. Museums found themselves in this space as some of the most innovative institutions. In many cities, they have become the centers of creative energy and local entrepreneurships. The experts even claim, and no jokes apart, it would be great if the museums could implement their experience outside to broadcast and transmit their creative energy to the development of the society in general. Museums or the access and the center of attraction, the access of modern cultures of social and public spaces. Museums also have a tremendous impact on the comprehension and the development of identities, both of general, national and transnational, and also individual identities. Museums, I mean modern museums, are trying to talk about controversial and contested topics, thus generating open discussions that are an indispensable and healing process both for the society and for each individual. Today, we all live in the smart society. We use the smartphones. We can find our way with the smart maps. Museums are using the smart technologies to spread the information about the collections easily, and this is much easier today as compared to even some 15 years ago. The smart museums are ready for the flows of smart audiences and visitors, and they were right to have this a solution. We might discuss the reasons after the lecture, but now let us see what unprecedented this phenomenon is, and maybe there were some cases before. If there were, what the consequences entailed. I tried to translate every slide for you to have these captions and information both in English and in Ukrainian. If you spot a mistake, I apologize for that. To start with, let's take a look at the outline. Why the boom? Why the evolution? Why the fashion? As we have discussed on the Skovoroda radio yesterday, instead of the word boom, which actually goes the same in all languages, I would like to use the English word bloom, which means the blossoming and flourishing, and I think this metaphor is more proper. If you think of the apple tree blossom, when you have all of the buds and flowers budding on the tree at the same time. So this budding time and blossoming time, this is something that the museums have and face today. Why the revolution? That's clear, because we are talking about the evolving process and the passing fad and fashion. Well, this fad might pass very soon if this process is too fast and just the fad. So, getting back to the outline, first we shall take a look on museums in the historical perspective and try to determine the key changes in the society that had their impact on the development of the museums. And we shall then consider social and cultural changes in the society in the 20th century, and we'll also focus on the subject of this public program this year. I will tell about the emergence of the Holocaust museums in the USA, and they actually launched this process of emerging museums on the subject all over the world. We can see some close links between the historical memory of society and the popular culture. In the third part, I will tell about the brightest and most fancy features of the museum boom, and one of them is to engage the star architects to design the new museums. I will highlight the link and even the dependence between the professional success of architects, of these star architects, and the success of the museums and the success of the cities where the modern museums prosper. So let us get down to the first part and try to think where are the present-day museums found in respect to the history of civilization on this scale of the evolution of the history of museums. We are now found in this weird museum crossword, interactive, multimedia, interpretive, participatory, and on and on. We inherited museums from ancient Greece, in fact. Museum as a term and the cultural social institutions as a concept of the open space for public exhibition, all of this goes back to ancient Greece, including the tradition of the central role of architecture in establishing a museum. We cannot overestimate the impact of the Greek architecture for the design of museums. But as antique and ancient times passed by, the notion of museums also vanished for many years to come, or many centuries to come. And the word museum seemed to be lost forever, and the Institute of Public Display and Exhibition was not needed by anyone. But suddenly, 20 centuries later, the museums emerged out of history in the Renaissance period in Italy, when the people of the world were offered for public display and public viewing the objects from the Pope's collection. But actually the museums as we know them today, they are the products of the Enlightenment period of the 17th century. Enlightening the broad audiences was the main role, and this was to create the social and cultural institution we still see today and visit today. In 1753, the British Parliament approved the Act on the establishment of the British Museum, which claimed it's not only for studying and entertainment of the people in interest, but also for the general use of the general public. And the very beginning it was stipulated that the entrance to the museum would be free admission, and this tradition goes down to these days. After that, the establishment of the British Museum launched the never-ending chain, and the museums were then opened later in the Netherlands, in France, in the USA, and in the second half of the 19th century, it was the first museum boom. In England, they opened 100 museums over 15 years. In Germany, 50 museums over 5 years. Museums even start employing new technologies. In that period of time, many collectors transformed their private collections into open collections accessible for general audiences. It was the boom and flourishing of philanthropy at the edge of the 19th and 20th century gave a huge impetus to the development of museums in different countries. Why so? Why the museums have suddenly become so important in the society? It actually reflected the growth of prosperity and welfare of wider audiences, and also the growing interest to the aesthetics of the cultural leisure time. If we think about what we have today, this is a very similar phenomenon. The charity holders themselves actually paid a lot of attention on the development and establishment of the museum. They play a role in creating the image of the museum, in attracting the audiences, focusing on the role of the museum as the temple of art. For example, the entrance to the museum, maybe you have paid attention, this is always the ascension. You have to go upstairs. Therefore, this sort of ascension by the end of the 19th century, and this is the first public museum which was opened in Kiev, and you can see the image of the building of the newly opened, presently the National Art Museum of Ukraine. Trying to compare, just to have a look on each phenomenon from the point of view of history, if we take a look at Pinakotheka, built upon request of the mayor of the Athens, and the City Museum of Arts in Kiev, you can see many similarities. So the 20th century came into full-fledged, and in the 20th century the museum world would follow the pace of history of this age, reflecting the political climate of each historical period. While in the early 20th century it was about creating the universal type national museums, consolidating this national ideas behind them. Later, the influence of the two world wars and the political turbulence of the 20th century did have their impact on the museum image. So the role of museums in the society also changes. You might have seen the photograph of this City Museum of Arts. This is 1938 Munich. The museum becomes one of the channels of the public propaganda, and the exhibitions reflect the ruling ideology, and it lasts for quite a long time. It was only in the 1960s that the new active wave of the development of the cultural sphere starts. The museum world flourishes in the 1960s. In the 1970s, it was not only the number of museums and attendance of museums that grew a lot, but also the range of the museum practices expanded and the new approaches appeared. One of the typical features of that time is that the museum space went beyond the museum walls. The landscape, the rural, the urban landscape became part of museum exhibitions and displays. The concepts of the open-air museums became very popular. Ethnographic museums, eco-museums, community museums, reserve museums, and others. The open-air museums aimed to preserve the historical and ethnocultural heritage for the natural environment in the certain area and region, engaging local population to the shared museum activities. You can see one of these examples. I know that in fact you can have more examples, but two of the largest museums of this type are found in Kiev and in Lviv. And it is great that these impressive large-scale museums were established upon the initiative of one Ukrainian historian, Petro Tonko. And I would like to draw your attention to the beauty and appeal of this concept, how the local citizens were engaged into the museum operations and activities. A second example, when the museum went beyond the museum walls. This is the Georges Pompidou Center. This is the contemporary art center in Paris. And in the 1970s, this weird inside out building actually provoked a lot of different feedbacks. You can see all of these escalators, stairs, and etc. And architects did it for purpose, and these are the routes of the visitors moving along the museum. This way, the museum space was turned with its face to the urban space. So this is similar to the intentions of the eco-museums. Today, the Pompidou Center, as you probably know, some of the most recognizable buildings in the world and huge attraction for tourists. Another example of those times that had crucially changed museum practices. Museums decided to go interactive. We're talking about the late 1960s. In 1969, a renowned American pedagogue and physicist, Frank Oppenheimer, actually established the unprecedented huge space museum exploratorium you can see on this slide. It was the museum revolution. Oppenheimer created the interesting educational world of the interactive museum. Any visitor coming to the museum would have to be engaged into some science tests or experiments. This museum was a very important event in the world of the museum and science. Since that time, hands-on exhibition, like put your hands on that, hands-on exhibitions become the norm in the museum practices. Starting from the 1990s, historical and subject-based museums followed the cause of the children's and science museums. These interactive approaches have become part of the adult academic museums. Also in the 1990s, many historical museums were creating and designing the so-called narrative-oriented exhibitions. In other words, these were the exhibitions designed on the principle of historical narration, not focusing on the objects displayed. Today, these exhibitions are called narrative exhibitions, and historical museums are increasingly more often trying to use this approach. One of the first narrative museums was the Holocaust Museum in the USA in Washington, D.C. It was not only the first museum with the exhibition built on the principles of the dramatic narration. It was also the first state public museum beyond Israel dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust. Should you have visited the lecture last week when they discussed new Jewish museums, you must have heard from the speakers about I would quote the speaker, this is the boom of Jewish museums. In fact, they started being established many years ago. The case with Polin, it was even 20 years ago. The director of the Polin Museum, Dr. Stolo, claimed that the idea of establishing the Jewish Museum in Warsaw actually came up after the Holocaust Museum was opened in 1993, when the historians came back from Washington to Poland. It was not only about Polin, but also many other Jewish heritage Polish museums were born in the 1990s. Today, you would take it quite naturally when another Jewish heritage museum is established, or the Holocaust Center. We are getting used to the emergence of such museums, but we know very well that it has not always been the case. Let's try to understand the roots of this process and how come that the first state public historical narration museum, not the memorial on the site of the tragedy, but the generalizing museum on the memory of the disaster that took place in Europe, it was opened in the USA, not in Europe itself. Why? With the exception of Israel, the first historical narrative-based museum on the tragedy of mass killings in the Second World War was opened only 50 years after the crime. what happened several decades later after the Second World War. Why at this time? Why the American society, why the state decided to establish this kind of museum? This part, and we do fit the timeline, this part of the lecture is going to be closely linked to the Jewish Days element in your program. And I believe the question that I'm going to tackle is going to be about the link between popular culture and collective memory. This is not typical for historians. Every year there is this topic suggested for the International Museum Day, trying to tackle the burning issues for the society at that moment. The topic of this year, 2017, is museums and the contested history. How do you talk about the hushed things in the museums? This is about the ability of museums to talk about the collective traumatic experience in public spaces, trying to provoke the visitors to think about the events that go beyond their individual experiences. And how do we communicate to society about some things that seem to be impossible to talk about? So now let's then go to the popular culture, which plays an important role in the shaping of the public conscious and collective memory. The discussions like these include the common and shared contemplation over the tragic events of the past. I will now try to establish the link between the splashes of these kind of collective discussions about the tragic events of the past and also of the cinematographic interpretations of these historic events. Cinema plays an important role in the shaping of collective memory because it can cover mass audiences. The dramatic film about the complicated historical events might cause some serious and deep reconsideration of these events by the entire community. Several decades after the tragic events in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, the memory about these events has remained personal, even hushed down in the US. Walter Reich, a famous American researcher, the former director of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., called this period the decades of the silent memory. I would like to quote some of his personal memories because I believe it fully renders the state of the public conscious. In 1953, in New York, Reich wrote in the university paper an article about the exhibition at the Evo Institute. It was an unusual exhibition for that time. It was dedicated to the 20th anniversary of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. On that day, Reich was walking down the campus of the Columbia University talking to his friend, amiable friend, professor of philosophy, who claimed, "Walter, I saw your article. Why are you still hooked on the Holocaust?" It was 20 years after the Holocaust. According to the memories of the survivors of the Holocaust who happened to find themselves in the US, nobody actually wanted to talk or to hear about this subject for many decades. It refers both to Jews and non-Jewish population. Many believed it too painful to talk about that. For survivors, this was the time of the new life. Since you survived, you had to build a new life. They were busy building this new life from scratch. So they were looking ahead, not backwards. In 1 week, the situation actually turned the tables. In April 1978, the American NBC channel showed the 9 hours TV series, The Holocaust. After that, the mass active discussion of the topic was provoked, and the large audiences of 120 million people were watching this mini TV series for 4 days. Millions of people first learned about the Holocaust. Millions of people were deeply distressed by the events the TV series presented. At the same time, the critics criticized the TV series as an example of showing the Holocaust in a criticizing way. One of the prominent authors surviving the Holocaust, the Nobel Prize winner, in his article of trivialization of the Holocaust, which was published several days later in New York Times, he wrote that it was really insulting, dishonest and cheap, the same as all of the TV production. This film is insulting for the dead and for the survivors. This documentary drama is not about the Holocaust as we remember it. In any case, in this kind of negative article, he admitted, and I'm quoting, "Many of those who have seen the film have been deeply touched and impressed. And I know this film did not target the audience like me, but those who haven't been there or haven't been born at that time. This is the film for those who only get to know about these death factories in the center, in the heart of civilized Europe." Indeed, many people do recollect that this TV series has become an impetus to provoke and evoke interest to this subject, including the people who have not known anything about the history of the Holocaust. The historian, the film historian, wrote about that the Idaho, Dakota, and New York citizens all over the territory of the USA first learned about the genocide of the Nazis against the Jews for many Jews who were born after the Second World War. This drama has been a revelation. And even though this TV series was criticized by many because they were trying to have a soap opera style, many of them still believe that it's better to have the soap opera rather than indifference and ignorance and silence of the previous decades. After several months, this TV series was shown on TV in different countries of Europe, and it had the similar powerful effect for the awareness and the reconsideration of the historical memory. And Wiesel wrote, "The Holocaust must be remembered, but not as a show. But how do we tell a story that cannot be told but should be told? How do we protect the memory of the victims? What is going to happen when the last survivor will die? I have no idea." End of quote. At the same time, one of the 120 million Americans who were watching the TV series Holocaust was the President Jimmy Carter. Several months later, in November 1978, President Carter established the Presidential Commission, Holocaust Commission, in order to develop the idea for the National Memorial for the Holocaust, and he invited Elie Wiesel to head the commission. The work of the commission resulted in the establishment of the State Memorial Museum of the Holocaust, which was built in Washington, D.C., in the capital of the country, in between the Congress building and the White House. As it often happens, there were some heated debate among the Jewish population of the US about this idea. Some of them were speaking against the idea at all, transforming the Holocaust memory into the institution. Other Jewish historians believed that historically Jewish memory has always been passed down through the institutions like synagogues, schools, and others, and the museum is the right place to do this. And I'm quoting, "This is the right place to preserve the memory, to tell the story, and to continue the public debate." The debate has been on until the very opening day of the memorial. The skeptical views would go, who would like to go to these terror cells? the parents would not bring their children to these horrible places. Are the Jews going to accept this museum? But in 1993, they finally opened the public museum of the history of the Holocaust. The museum has become one of the largest research centers for the Holocaust and was instrumental into the development of the Holocaust memory. The museum is visited by 2 million people daily. 90% of them are non-Jewish. Therefore, irrespective of our attitude to this fact, the project of popular culture created by pop culture, for pop culture, has become the driving force to launch the broad discussion about the mass killing disaster. The society would obviously be on that way. We definitely could talk about this in a deeper way and in a more detailed manner, but now we shall continue the line and the degree of influence of such projects on the development of historical memory. This mini TV series has changed the attitude of the society to the subject under discussion, but also it has changed our attitude to this event. Over the decades until 1978, the disaster and the atrocity of the Nazis against the Jewish population was using only the Hebrew word Shoah, or the Hubrun in Yiddish. After the TV series Holocaust, this Greek word has been generally accepted term. Holocaust means the total extermination with fire. Even more so, the Holocaust transferred to the center of the US consciousness, but also the Jewish perception. The TV series influenced and had an effect on two fundamental touchstones of the historical memory. On the one hand, it was about the perception of the society of the general historical memory. On the other hand, the readiness and the willingness of the survivors to tell about something they preferred to be silent about before. On the one hand, the film told about the Holocaust to those who have not known about it, but on the other hand, he actually instigated those who knew too much to share their painful memories, whatever painful they are, to tell how it all was, how as they knew it. Otherwise, somebody else will do this instead of them with the imagined characters of the TV series. Later, the group of volunteers started recording interviews with the survivors. 2 years later, the first 200 videos were transferred to the archive of the Yale University. Today, this is a well-known video archive of Yale University with 4,500 interviews in 22 languages recorded in different countries. It was one of the first projects of oral history. Therefore, the Holocaust has become a subject for public discussion some 30 years later after the tragic events. Why did they need so many years of silence? In the biblical notion for the generation originating from the Egypt, 40 years passed before the Jewish people could start the new year, because this generation was under the strong influence of trauma, of this traumatic experience of slavery. The same happened to the post-Holocaust generation. They had to live through these decades and to overcome this post-horror, post-terror, post-trauma period. Every family had to cope with their pain on their own. Many of them wanted to forget the unwanted memories forever. You need time to heal the wounds of terror. So you can see this establishment of the Holocaust Memorial, but at the same time the process of creating similar museums was ongoing. For example, like we could hear about it last week from the Pauline Museum director, the ideas, the links, the phenomena, and also this is the sign of globalization, that the ideas travel from one museum to another, and you have this concept of establishing the museum of the history of Polish Jews. This is already the link to the present day and to the 1990s, which was the most important time of considering and perceiving and collecting the memory on the Holocaust. There is a term that we shouldn't be mentioning now, but this was the eyewitnesses' time. The 1993 and the flame of this candle of memory about the Holocaust would resume with a new force all over the world, closely related to another interpretation of the tragic events when there was the Schindler List film. Before that, there was the unprecedented 10 hours long documentary show by Claude Lanzmann, and there was the result of the 10 years of hard work. He had to interview the eyewitnesses, those who were part of the Holocaust from all sides, the survivors, the perpetrators, and the witnesses. The Lanzmann film went out in 1975, and it received public recognition and had a huge impact on the audiences, but mostly on the Jewish audiences. So what made the entire world to talk about the atrocity against the Jewish population in the Second World War? It was the piercing psychological drama, even though the critics would criticize, because Lanzmann himself would call the Schindler's List as the kitsch of the soap opera, but the white audiences were deeply touched. For Europeans and those who were born after the war, and the individual human drama perplexed the viewers emotionally and deeply. And I personally know the historians like this in Italy and France who are dealing with the history of the Holocaust as inspired by this event. Annette Indrop, the mother who survived 3 concentration camps, felt deeply grateful to have the history of the Holocaust finally be revealed and communicated in the large-scale feature film for millions to see. In fact, after a short time, 7.5 million viewers have seen the film in the US cinemas. Over 2 months of the show of this film in Germany, there were 6 million viewers watching the film. The effect of the film, The Schindler's List, was even more dramatic in Germany because it started the process of active collective reconsideration of history. It instigated the open public discussion in the German media, engaging every magazine and newspaper. But the main subject for discussion was not about the film. It was about what does Germany know about its past, and why would most of the Germans could not do more to help the victims. If we have time, I would like to tell you about the fact that Spielberg actually resumed the oral history initiative. He established the center. Many of you know it. It's called the Shoah. These are the recordings of the interviews with the survivors. In 1990, they had 50,000 interviews with the Holocaust survivors. And this film had a tremendous influence on the museum world as well. Even though this film was a memorial in itself, it actually provoked the establishment of new museums, of new projects to commemorate the memory of these events. As a result and in response of the demand of the society, the Holocaust Museum opened the exhibition about Oskar Schindler. In the long-term prospect, the elevated and activated interest to Krakow made the city buy the former Schindler's factory building and to create the museum about the German occupation of Krakow from 1943 to 1945. The exhibition of this museum applies very many modern museums of dramatization of museum exhibitions. For example, this slide shows the corner of the room from the ghetto. You can see the old lady sitting in the room. This is the generalized image of one of those we have seen in the Schindler's List film. In the 1990s, during all of the decade, there was this historical activization of focus on this topic. Today we can see new museums opening all over the world, and it's very difficult and hardly feasible to list the Holocaust museums all over the United States. They are available from Texas to Indiana. Many new museums are opening today. It's incredible, but today, the 21st century, the interest to this kind of museums is still huge. Many museums that have been established in the 1990s are expanding and reconstructing their showrooms. Many of them are newly opened over the last several years. The Holocaust museums were opened all over the world, from Japan to Guatemala, literally. This year they have opened the first Holocaust museum in Central America. But now let us take a look at the opening of the so-called universal museums in different countries. And let us consider interesting examples of the extraordinary and extravagant architecture samples. So, the museum world entered the 21st century with a sensational statement and a challenge, opening the Grand Museum of Contemporary Art in Bilbao. In a small Spanish town, this grand building of the museum was designed by a famous Canadian-American architect, Frank Gehry. It was the building of the museum, and I keep looking on the museum. It was the building that hugely attracted the tourists. It was a risky and a bold and far-fetching solution of the city administration to fund this construction. Actually boosted the incredible economic development of the town. Local authorities funded the construction. They invested 100 million euro. The sensational success of the museum surpassed all of expectations. In the first 3 years after the opening, the tourists brought to the budget of the region 500 million. 100 million of investment, original investment, was resumed in the form of taxes. So this is to prove that this was the incredibly profitable economic project. In the recent years, the economy of the region is largely based on the tourists and attracting tourists. Many other locations learned lessons from this project, so they addressed Gehry to build exactly the same museum in their cities, using the exactly same design. Recently, the British magazine The Economist informed that in the coming 10 years, over 24 of new large-scale museum centers will be opened in different countries, with the planned investment of $250 billion. And The Economist mentioned Arsenal in Kiev among these. The largest exhibition area in Europe, 50,000 square meters. Therefore, the new feature of the Call of the Time actually changed the attitude to museums in the society. Museum is already the fancy type of creative leisure time. Young people, as I have already mentioned, are going to museums. The museum statistics also claims that the museum audiences are getting to be even younger. For the contemporary urban planning model, a popular city museum is an important development factor. Obviously, to attract the audiences, the architectural society is not sufficient. The museums are actively modernizing their practices and engaging the technological advances all over. The museums are trying to be small. There is even this fad for the small museums. The large-scale projects would usually be based on the top-down approach, the large investments coming from authorities, while the small museums actually come from the grassroots levels, and the number and variety and diversity of these museums is increasing. Many museums focus on some unusual topics. For example, the Museum of Virginity in Istanbul. Many of you might know about this. The Nobel Prize winner, the great writer Arkan Pamuk, he actually left behind his writing art to create the museum. The Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb, the Museum of Toilets in India, the Museum of Mushroom in France. Some words about the museum that I have mentioned many times to students. Why would I resort to it all over again? One of the reasons is about the crowdsourcing case. The authors of the project made up the crowdsourcing before the crowdsourcing has entered the speech. Unlike the oversaturated and sometimes excessively large museums, this illustration shows that small museums focus on the minimalistic approach, the individual, almost intimate history that reaches out to everyone. The history of this museum started from the act in the internet. The authors actually address people on the internet to send one object related to the history of their own broken relationship experience and tell a story of this one object. People were sending the materials from all over the world. The exhibits sent and the stories made up the exhibition, and it had huge success. As a result, the authors of the concept created a new museum. Since the beginning of the 21st century, another museum trend has become popular, which is looking outside the museum walls, engaging the city programs like the night of museums. This idea was first born in Berlin in 1997, and today over 100 of European cities are part of these activities. I know that Lviv is also part of it, and the first night of the museums aimed to attract wide audiences to the museums who would not pay attention to museums otherwise. In the US, the favorite initiative in the row of similar activities are the actual sleepovers in the museums, the spending the night, literally spending the night, the sleepovers in the building of the closed museum. On the slide, you can see the children sleeping over in one of the most popular New York museums. This is the Natural History Museum in New York. I think this is quite a bright example of a new approach to museum activities. It's hardly possible to imagine to have this adventurous approach of curators to their museums in the 20th century. But this is the new norm of the 21st century. For some, it looks like too much, like the arcade. For others, this is the new approach of informal education that has a growing demand, both in professional area and obviously in family time. If the family spends some time in a museum, it is already perceived as a norm all over. The museum exhibitions are not a static linear experience any longer. All modern museums are trying to add some dramatic charge to their exhibitions. For example, in Lviv, this is the exhibition for Pritzker Castle in the Lviv National Art Gallery. They are trying to engage different multimedia IT approaches. Many museums went even further, trying to engage the cinematic and dramatic approaches. For example, the British Museum. The British Museum made a film about their exhibition, the exhibition that is connected to the so-called blockbuster exhibitions, The Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum. It was shown in thousands of cinemas in 50 countries of the world. London managed to attract crowds of tourists from Paris with this approach. And as you know, Louvre is the most visited museum in the world. A question, there is a question. Do we still have 1 minute for the video from the British Museum if we are successful? That looks like a thriller or a detective story, a commercial, but this is the 21st century and the audience is, well, does it function? Well, repetition is the background for memorizing. This is the good example to confirm another statement that museum is fancy, is in fashion for many people, for many young people, and it's even for some of the youngest audiences, for teenagers. It's not even understandable or clear what concepts or what museums of the distressed type of the museum we are talking about. So many things have changed over the last 10 or 15 years. They could never understand the previous type of museums. And now let's get to architecture. Meanwhile, all over the world, new grand museums, crucially different museums are opened. The Contemporary Art Museum in that respect is the leader. The American magazine The Atlantic in 2002 developed a new cultural phenomenon, the Bilbao Effect. So it took several years, obviously, to summarize. The article claimed that the success of Bilbao had a huge impact on the attitude of other cities to museums, and some crucially different architectural projects. Local authorities are now inviting for the construction of new museums in their cities the so-called starchitects. That is the word. That is not a formal term, and it's probably not the best term to use. Many architects actually take it very negatively. We might call these architects like superstars, but it's about the architects who are actually loved and admired by their colleagues, and some of their landmark projects are very well known all over the world. So this is not a new phenomenon, because in the Renaissance period, the status actually was also assigned for the main architects. They were working for the patrons, they were building the temples. Today, the museums are called the new temples of our time, so I believe the starchitects, they resumed the historical tradition. Why would the architecture museums matter that much? Because the extravagant museum buildings add up to their success, and also they are an effective tool to attract more tourists. Therefore, we might conclude the museums actually contribute a lot to these cities. But what would museums do for the architects? If we take a look on the life and the projects of the prominent, well-known contemporary architects, we might notice that every other famous and well-known architect actually joined the category of the starchitects due to the innovative design of a museum. I have already mentioned the Pompidou Center. It was designed by the Italian architect Renzo Piano and the British architect Richard Robinson in 1977. The Pompidou actually made the piano well recognized in the world, and 2 years ago Piano created a new magnet for tourists in New York, confirming his starchitect status. The new American Art Museum of Whitney, the ship building that rises high above the Hudson Bay, has become the new center for attraction overnight. This is the work of some of the most known architects of these days. This is Daniel Libeskind. He used to work in a wide range of projects. He created the commercial, cultural facilities, residences, trade centers, universities, concert halls, hotels, and others. Today he is best known for as a head of the master plan in the reconstruction of the World Trade Center in New York that was destroyed in the terror acts on September 11, 2001. Oddly enough, please pay attention to the following fact, that it took many years for Libeskind to implement at least one of his projects. His design was considered to be impossible to implement. The first large-scale Libeskind's project that was actually implemented was the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Libeskind was 52 years of age at the time. It was one of the first buildings designed in Berlin after the reunion of Germany. His parents survived the Holocaust, and he suggested to have this zigzag type of the building, or maybe the distorted Star of David. And you can have many void spaces, and he wanted to focus and highlight this image of the void after the Jews disappeared from the Berlin. The museum remained empty for 2 years more after it was constructed, but then they opened access to the building. 2 years before the opening of the museum, 350,000 people came to this empty, void building of Libeskind. And this is the work of the world-known architect who died last year, Zaha Hadid. Her story is worthy of attention due to the obvious reason, because she is the only lady architect in this list of these architects that usually is reserved for men. In 2004, Zaha Hadid was the first woman who was awarded with the prestigious Pritzker Award. And this award is often claimed to be the Nobel Prize level in architecture. Hadid overcome the professional threshold and acquired global popularity due to the unconventional design project. They have discussed many of the designs by her in many magazines, professional scale, but her career actually gained momentum when her design project for a museum was awarded. It was the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, and she was the first lady architect of the contemporary museum design in the US. I have already mentioned about the surreal scale of the museum boom in China. You can see the oldest city and art museum in the desert of Inner Mongolia in China. It is a very representative case to show the attitude of Chinese people to museums, designed by the young Chinese architect Ayan Song. This is another example of this architect gaining popularity due to the museum design. At the time when China experienced the huge economic growth, this design project was offered. The shape of the oldest museum is not the only unusual aspect of this design. Another unusual thing was that Yang Song was supposed to create a museum building in the city that has not been built yet. It has not even existed yet. At that time, it was just one building surrounded by the oldest desert, but they discovered the oil and gas deposits and started developing this area only after 2001. After the municipal authorities decided to invest into some of the first objects, it was actually the museum. Unfortunately, the museum did not have any specific idea behind. It doesn't have any collection or the exhibition plan, but at the moment, even though this building is still empty, it has become a popular meeting place for local people and young people. The case of orders shows that the example of Bilbao is not universal at all. If you have the extravagant building in the city, it is not enough to attract the tourist flow. I would like to use the metaphor from one of the locals. 600 kilometers away from Peking might equal to the million of light years from Beijing. And here is another contested example of the reverse side of the Bilbao effect. As I have already mentioned, after Bilbao, many cities wanted to have their own museums according to Frank Gehry's project design, including Seattle. For their pop culture museum, Gehry created this thing. Some people claim that this museum duly renders the image of American rock music, but most critics believe this is not the best sample of Gehry's works. Some believe this is ugly. For example, the Forbes magazine included this museum into the top 10 ugliest buildings in the world. And to conclude, one of my personal favorite examples, the art museum in the city of Milwaukee, by the design of a famous Spanish architect, Santiago Calatrava. This is the building that looks like a giant bird on the bank of the Michigan Lake. This design was the first building by Calatrava in the US. It was not by chance, as you might assume, that this is the first design in the US was a museum building. What is unique about this building is these are the wings. This bird has the wings that move, and it actually unfolds every day. It's literally, when the museum opens, the wings are unfolded, and then they are folded in the end of the opening hours. And actually, the movements of these wings beautifully imitate the movement of the actual wings of a bird. And the design was born as a result of close cooperation with the Museum Council. They wanted to create something exclusive for their city. It only took 3 years to build this building, and it has become the Milwaukee symbol. Some words about the funding of such projects. It is important to mention. Europe and the USA, you might remember that in Bilbao, and also you have your experience respectfully, local authorities do fund the museum projects. In the museum world in the USA, a lot depends on the donors, on the patrons. This is the example of this kind of approach. This pavilion is called the Quadrature Pavilion, to commemorate the name of the family who were the major sponsors of the construction of the building. I would like to show this in motion. These are very short videos, but there are 2 of them. One of them shows the dramatic opening, unfolding of the wings every morning, and the second, very close, a time lapse for unfolding and folding. So let us start with the first one, showing the opening, the unfolding. The span of the wings is 66 meters. It takes quite a long time, some 5 minutes. Of course, this is the time lapse, but please pay attention to the gracious movement. It's incredible. If you stay down there and watch it, it seems incredible. And you can see this is impressive. The entire structure, which is very big and solid, but this is a very good museum with a very large collection. And now let's have a quick look on the opening and closing of unfolding and folding to have an impression. It's good we have YouTube. God bless. Two years ago, Santiago Calatrava, the architect, designed a new, very interesting museum in Rio de Janeiro, the Museum of Tomorrow. I would like to quote Calatrava's speech at the opening of this museum. Rio de Janeiro is a sample and a model for all of the world. How to recover public spaces, urban spaces, by intervening crucially and creating the cultural centers. The exhibition of the museum is built in a very unusual way. It is designed as a search for answers to 5 questions. Where did we come from? Who are we? Where are we? Where are we going? And how do we want to live together over the next 50 years? So these are the open philosophical questions to conclude my lecture as well. we would like to truly thank you for this interesting and saturated lecture. At the Radio Skovoroda, we would often say, love what you do and do what you love. And we will have another person to confirm this rule. This is Ludmila Gordon. Any questions, comments, calls for revolution? And you will have to raise your hand to get a microphone. Thank you for this bright lecture. Could you please tell us, what do you think? What could we do with the Soviet legacy? Do you think it might diversify the modern museum spaces, or maybe we should discard it and get rid of our history? Obviously, since there is no consensus in the society about the Soviet history, but there is huge interest on the part of foreign citizens, because for them this is some sort of Soviet exotic element. Didn't you like the photo from the Lenin's museum? Actually, it was very complicated to find a photo that would show something I would like to talk about. For example, the Olympics exhibition in the Berlin Museum in 1936. It is able to tell many things about the aesthetics of the Nazi ideology, about the total scale of this aesthetics. It would be wrong to discard it from our history. We have to know about this. So if you talk about the Soviet legacy and ask what do we do about this, this is the huge burden that we all carry, me including. We will have to cope with it. We will have to overcome it. And life is all about fighting and overcoming things. But we obviously cannot pretend we have not had it. That would be wrong. I'm sorry if I fail to understand, because I seem to understand many things, but I represent the Museum of Toys, and 80% of the exhibits are actually the Soviet heritage. I have a question about the small museums. So I represent a very small museum with a large collection. So I have one question about maybe some best practice of the small museum success story that you were impressed with, and the second question about the children coming to a museum. So this theory has been in the air for some time, but there is one extreme position, not to let them go to the Disneyland, but they could stay in the museum. But maybe how we could improve this educational process in this museum space. The question about the education space in the museums, whether it's good or not, can you give some best examples of the small museums and the best examples of the best educational format in the format of the museums for children? Which small museum were you impressed with most? I've been telling about it hundreds of times. This is true. A small museum, this is, for example, the Museum of Dreams. I was not impressed by it, I couldn't say, but it was interesting to me. But the Museum of Broken Relationship, this is something I was impressed by, because I think it was breaking the taboos on the one hand, because I believe ethics in the museums is very important. I treated it as a sort of breaking the rules, like a person unclothing in front of the others. As to me, I wouldn't be telling or sharing this story in public. But at the same time, it is very important to empower a person willing to talk about this, to shout about this pain to the rest of the world. On the one hand, this is some sort of the healing process for this person, but as to people who came to the museums and read a story of different exhibits, this is great. First of all, you can learn you're not the only one. you're not the only one with this sad experience you could not manage. There are many people over there. Of course, you could use the social media and follow all of that, but you could also come to the museum. I think in that respect, museums are not different from journalism. Journalists would have the personal blogs, right? So there is also this issue whether blogs are journalism or not. So it's very difficult to choose one example because each museum has its own peculiarity and it's interesting in itself. As to museums, they're all great. I'm always envious to the museums that offer cultural programs. I showed the exhibition a complex arsenal. I was really envious. It was all so modern, with so many opportunities, with so many new albums and colors and paints and special rooms where preschoolers and school pupils could come with their parents and actually plaster something with clay, with the real clay. For me, it's something incredible because I grew up in the Soviet Union and then we lived for many years in the USA, in the capital of the USA, where there was the only museum with at least some children program once in a month. You have to apply for that program to make a reservation 6 months in advance. That is why I think any museum offering any program like that is great and it's impressive. I really admire the Metropolitan Museum in New York with their program, but they learn from each other. That is why every day we can see new approaches in a new museum that was used 6 months before in another museum. Good evening. Thank you for this interesting lecture. I have several questions to you. Question number one, it's about Jewish museums and museums on the dramatic Jewish history, the Holocaust museums in particular. You have mentioned that the Washington museums, visitors, 90% of them are non-Jewish. So my question is, what is the role of these museums for the descendants of Jews? For the third generation of Jewish descendants who survived the Holocaust. As far as I know, very often Jewish school children from Israel and also from the USA must visit the Holocaust sites in Europe, and they have the organized tours and travel, for example, to Poland, and they go to Auschwitz, to Warsaw Ghetto. After these tours, on internet and on Instagram and in other social media, you have the photos like, I was here, hello Auschwitz, etc. So this is from the descendants of the survivors of the Holocaust. So my question would be, what is the role of these museums and visits of the Jewish sites for the third generation of Jews, and what is the fate of historical museums with the dramatic past in the coming years, in the 21st century, for example? How historical museums should try not to lose their mission? This is one question, quite a long. And the next question is about the commercialization in museums in particular. Where is this borderline between attracting the visitors to the museum and not losing their true mission? We can very often see that people go to the Louvre or to the Vatican museums not for the sake of art, but you know, for their self-esteem. I was here. So the first question, what is the role of modern Jewish museums about the Holocaust for the third generation of the Jews? For the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors. And the argument to that question were the selfie photos in Instagram and Facebook. We can see that the grandchildren of these survivors would take photos like saying, hello, I'm in Auschwitz, and this is more fun for them rather than living through the experience of their grandparents. I think you should never generalize. If one person makes a selfie and doesn't quite understand where he is and why, well, this is sad. But it's not representative for the generation in general. Last year, I personally witnessed a similar situation. It was very painful when there was a dilemma how to respond to young girls, like 15 and 16-year-olds, probably Americans. They were taking photos on these booths, you know, on the Danube River bank in the Budapest. They filmed with one photo, another photo, they were giggling. It was really distressing to watch. But what is worse, it was very difficult to decide how to respond. To act as a strict teacher, or maybe to keep silent and wait, because it's just another moment to take. This is just one of the examples. It was very difficult to decide. As a result, we approached them and talked to them. I was very nervous because actually this monument is very dramatic. It combines both the mothers and the children's booths. I was trying to explain this to them, but at the same time, the ladies did not really know what the monument was. They thought that these were just the shoes along the river. They thought it was the beach idea or whatever. So the question is rather not about the selfies and the problem with that, but the role of the third generation, the role of these museums for the third generation of Jews. I do understand the question, but I would like to respond with another question. What is the role of Anna Frank's diary book for the third generation of Jews? The same. Those who want to learn more have a chance to learn more. Those who are not able to learn about this, the publication of books or creating the smart museums would not help. This is the role. Those who want to know more, they have a chance to go to the smart museum and feel, and the awareness of history is not about his individual process at home, but this is the open discussion engaging both museum workers, the curators, the people attending this exhibition, and others, something like that. And the second question about the commercialization of the museums. For example, if you come to Louvre, you go there to have the check out the Foursquare or somewhere just to claim I've been there. Well, this is in human nature. I really am concerned for Van Gogh in particular. For me, it's very personal because I know the nature of this person, and I can only imagine what he would think now about all of these scarves that the ladies take on after the Van Gogh Museum. Well, let's criticize, or maybe let's not follow their example, but you can never change the human nature. Maybe you can change the rules for attending the museums. This is a very interesting question. Let's talk about that. Can you offer any 3 rules? For example, leave your phone at the entrance? Yeah, yes, okay, why not? This is the open and a question and thoughtful question, but then nobody will go to the museums. Thank you. Irina Matsevko. You might use the headsets because you have your favorite questions that consist of 4 parts. Absolutely. To start with, I would like to thank you for this a multifold lecture that offered and combined 3 different focuses into one. So I would like to focus on the following. Showing this last part, you might produce an impression that the form dominates the content. I haven't been to the American museums, but some of the weird European museums I attended, I have some impressions. But the content is quite of a high quality. I was trying to find the selection of the modern museums for the designer of the program, and I was really sick of this contemporary architecture. When you watch the dozens of these samples, it doesn't seem so attractive. But this is some sort of the commercial trick, but actually you see the huge work and efforts of the team behind it, who are able to ask these questions. What is museum all about? What are we trying to show? How do we show this? And what is the message that we're trying to bring through? So I have a very practical question to you. Who is the contemporary museum worker? I failed to mention that you have the MA in museum studies, and the museum workers, I think it's very important for us. All of the museum workers must have, probably they have the degree in museum studies. So who are the museum staff today? Who are these? What is their educational background? Is there the multidisciplinary background, or maybe they need to have some specialized degree to work in a museum, to work on sustainable or permanent or temporary exhibitions? And the second thing you mentioned in the lecture about the European museums, the same as in Ukraine, they are funded by the state mostly, and it's taking the centralized line to local level. And you might get an impression they get a lot of money there, over there, and that's why it's so good with them. But with us, the funding is quite limited. Maybe you could talk more about some arguments, because I believe funding and finance is not the largest problem in the museums. If you don't agree to me, please tell me why. If yes, please talk about other things that might make the present-day museums very interesting, good, and high quality, in addition to money. So maybe you could dwell upon some of other important components apart from finance. I think it's good you were listening to the translation. The content and the form and the content, yes? Yes, of course. The Ordos example, isn't it great? Here you have the form but no content, but people have the location to visit. While you were talking, I was thinking about several things. Well, this question is out of date, Irina. Like, what professional degree a museum staff shall have? Well, it depends on what you're doing in your museum, and secondly, it depends what kind of museum that is. And actually, well, a historical contemporary exhibition in a team that we work in, it includes a writer, a poet, an architect, a designer, an engineer, a historian, an economist, well, something like that. What is great about this, well, actually not about the small museums, of course. It's very difficult. The chemical composition of work is very different. But we talk about the largest scale museums. What is great about these projects is the team. It's always the teamwork. Something like you have in a cinema production. You now ask of who works in the museum, but who produces the films? You might say the director, the film director. Yes, maybe. but a film director alone would never make a film. Well, the cameraman, yes, maybe, but without the film director, the cameraman will not manage. So this is the teamwork. The functioning museum today needs ideas of a creative designer. My students were telling me about the projects in Ukraine when you just need to be an artist, a painter with a vision, and the museum will start an absolutely different story. We have been to the exhibition and you know what I mean. So you probably need to be the artist or a painter. But on the other hand, what about the manager who is going to arrange all of this or to manage all of this in terms of developing the concept and finding the solution, the balanced approach, the tangibility and feasibility of this approach. As to the specific degree, yes, of course, there is this fad, because I use this word for a purpose. We have lived through this boom a long time ago. You might know this psychoanalysts claim suddenly all of this has become very topical. In the 1990s, it has been discussed every now and then. Today, museums, well, it doesn't imply that the professionals are different. If there is a professional person, they're doing their best on their position. So maybe what we are talking about, the argument to convince you to go to the Contemporary Museum to find it interesting. Well, funding is just one of the cornerstones. The building is always built on the four cornerstones. The concept. If you need to design a mission. You need to know what the museum is about. If we talk about the historical museum, if you have some exhibition because you suddenly get a funding and you have no idea that the museum has to understand the audiences that could visit this museum. You need to develop the concept and understand your prospective audiences. This is some of the most important things. Well, funding, that's clear. The third cornerstone, which I think is very important, is to identify what will be in the exhibition, the space. Is it going to be inviting or suffocating for you? How you are going to design and to develop the narration in your museum? Do you want to make a theatrical experience out of it, such as you're watching a movie? For example, the Budapest Holocaust Center, it's this type, you don't get a clue whether you have been in a museum or not. As soon as you enter the first room, they put the lights off and you have the loud music, and you have the 1930s and the 1940s music, and all of the visit time you don't see anything, but you just hear many things. Well, reading the information written by historians who have been researching for many years and studying the materials. I'm not criticizing here, I'm just telling. So this was the third cornerstone. How do you present this information? We understand who we should be addressing and why, and then we have to understand how we are doing things. And the next thing is the scrupulous research of the materials. Anyone writing one word on the caption, on the label, or in the extended introduction to the whole should be in charge and should be responsible for every word, for every fact. The same like in journalism. First you check the copyright and then you check the fact, do the fact finding by the editorial board, etc. And here you should be a historian, the author, the editor. The information that will be presented in the museum, especially in the historical museum, is really a very responsible thing to do. I would like to tell you the following thing, that I have been to many museums. In particular, I had a chance to see the ruins that have been destroyed in 2000 and something in New York. And I would like to tell you that some people, some part of mankind believes and think about how to design new weapons, new aircraft, new things to destroy as many people as possible. But at the same time, there are people who are creating museums. They are creating culture, and it is a pleasure to hear about this and that you're telling about this. I'm sorry that you didn't include into your lecture the Israeli museums, Yad Vashem, the Jerusalem Museum, because we are beyond, these are the days of Jewish culture in Lviv. So it would be good for our students, and not only to have a look on something that the Jewish people created in the last years on the sands, in the locations where nothing was growing. And this is a miracle to watch. So if you come next time, please also tell us about the Jewish museums. I have been to many museums, both in New York and Boston and Paris and Berlin and Moscow and many other cities on the Holocaust. Of course, this is a tragedy and a disaster, but maybe when people watch and they become better. Thank you. I would like to say thank you for your question. Thank you so much, because a story about the Yad Vashem Museum was part of my lecture and I had to cut it short. And the Yad Vashem Museum was part of this lecture in the English language because I do believe that Yad Vashem is one of the most powerful museums and the strongest museum when you talk about the Holocaust museums. For me, this is the most important, maybe the only museum that I truly respect. Why it was part of my lecture in the English language? Because Moshe Safdie, who created the great, ingenious project design, and it is fully implemented as of today, so I just didn't have time, and maybe it requires another time to talk about it. The project implemented at Yad Vashem was suggested by the author in the 1960s, and the Museum Council rejected it because they claimed it was too modern. So this is some sort of Disneyland, they claimed, when he presented his project. And this was the 1990s, when many things changed and the project turned out to be feasible, somehow the same project. So I do agree with you. Thank you for your question. All of the stones to my side, because actually I asked Ludmila to talk about museums in general. And thank you for this question, and it implies the topic is very interesting and we are going to have another lecture to this topic. While you are throwing the stones, I will move to another question. We shall listen about the Holocaust Museum in Washington by Vadim Alskin next week on July 25. And you will be able to ask questions about this museum next Tuesday. Thank you to Ludmila for this trip, and you took us on this trip along these great projects, the WOW projects. But my question is about the museums, and there are most of them in the world. These are old museums. How do they find their new roles? How could they see themselves as relevant, but also not deplore being old? How do they become new but respect their past at the same time? Could they become modern? The second question, could rich museums be socially relevant and sensitive? And is it possible everywhere? Or are we talking about some discourse of global cities and examples of global cities? And these are the cases of the countries with a lot of resources. But what could be a museum like in a country which is in crisis, which is poor, and whether this rich wow museum could be a symbol of what? And also we could try to compare this museum boom correlate with another boom for mega events. In some countries they have some very positive effects, while in other countries where they have high expectations for change with these mega events, this is the effect of wasted resources and the exhausted area afterwards. I think well, that's it about my questions. No, maybe the last question. If we take a look not only on, if we take a more diverse look on the global geography, but if we take a look on the broader infrastructure in the society, maybe you could talk about some other institutions that are critical to make a museum good, relevant, critical, entertaining, and all that. So what links and relations to other institutions are important for museums, crucial for museums? I will start from the end. So which institutions should the museums cooperate with to be, who they depend on or who they should be contacting with? Who they should depend on, I mean in good sense of the word. I think, well, you're now answering your question yourself. That's clear that this is education, educational, not only universities, but also it's not quite fair statistics, because each statistics needs to be taken relatively. You should take a closer look what kind of 90% of non-Jewish population who visit the Holocaust Museum. The answer would be, I can see it in the room, the school pupils. This has become part of the curriculum. Whether there is much initiative in this visit coming from these people in particular. I have talked a lot to our students about that. The phenomenon of the so-called approaches when the community living in certain area could be the co-authors of the projects implemented by the museum. It is a very contemporary, a very modern trend. We are seeing many more manifestations of this trend. This could be the engagement of people who were offered to participate and they sent their exhibits. Maybe these are personal stories or the photos to the specific subject. I was telling about the project, about the changing faces of Brooklyn, when the museum decided to have an experiment and to see what comes out of it. But the philosopher Org writes that the opinion of the crowd on a large scale actually is the same as the conclusions of the experts. So first it was the academic book and they transformed this project into the real life experience, and the conclusions were exactly as they expected. But another point is how to run this project. It was the engagement of the community, but it turned out these were not only the Brooklyners who decided to be engaged, these were people from all over the world. These were the representatives of 60 different countries. So the answer to your question, of course, this should be the community, the link to the community, a community of people that the museum is oriented at. Each museum, the same as each magazine, has its own audiences. Some people read some magazines or some blogs of magazines and never open others. The same goes about museums. In addition to the general cultural program curriculum, when the school children are brought by schools there, but there are also people who are interested in these topics. How do you find them? How do you identify them in the crowds to make the people come back to your museum? Not like in Louvre, when you go to Paris and you take a photo and you have landmark check, but how do you make the audiences come back to your museums? This is more related to the subject-based museums, to understand and to like your audience. But the question was about many more things. You mean the mega events? You mean the night of museums? Well, this is not the question to ask me. I'm just a small person and I like it quiet in the museum. When there is a huge crowd and everyone is dancing, it's not for me. In the Athens, due to Olympics, you have the functioning subway system. What Calatrava made, it's more about Calatrava, not about the city. The same as Gary's work and this creature coming out of the sea. But this is the problem of architects, not about the mass events or Olympics. But the debate of why the cities need these mega events, I would always think about it myself. I'm trying to understand the opinion of those who claim that cities find it beneficial. Somehow Paris and Los Angeles competed very much to get the nomination. For me, these large-scale mass projects are something alien to me. That's why I would not be able to answer this question. But well, actually, I would advocate for small museums. I'm trying to. Let's not talk about the museums all the time. Let's talk about the small museum as an initiative, which could be much more interesting and smart than very similar, identical contemporary art museums. And you don't quite understand what you're looking at in these museums, and you really feel like saying the king is naked. I would give it the example from the early 20th century when the aircraft was invented. Big companies invented many things. They had huge projects and a lot of investment into something that was impossible to be created. You had these hot air balloons flying all over the cities. The two Wright brothers, they were actually flying over the sands on the beach, and they created the aircraft. It was a small creative project, a small museum, but it was more to the point and hit the ground and hit the target, unlike the large-scale projects. It's not always, if you have a chance to engage the community, the team, the city, the region. But when I was talking about the process of the megamania, I actually asked the question in the end for how to name it, whether it is a positive or constructive or evolutionary thing to create these grand museums in such big numbers all over the world, or is it just a passing fad? I have two questions and two comments to make. Is there today a trend that museums, especially new museums, especially those that were created in the last 10 years, maybe they don't focus on research, but they rather focus on exhibiting things, displaying things. It's clear that any exhibition is based on the research and some study, but the permanent exhibitions and there are temporary exhibitions. If this is the subject-based museum, then do you see this trend that the research activities in the museums is declining? This is just the question. I have this question based on my observation for the operations of Ukrainian museums. I might be wrong, and I'm ready to accept the stones thrown at me. But I think that today in the museums in Ukraine, the research and science, they don't live there any longer. And the second question, in your opinion, when a new, large museum is built, something you described tonight, when this new museum is built, it is conceived by the architect as an architectural facility and an architectural concept, or should there be this dual approach between what kind of museum it is and what the museum is about, and is it reflected and manifested in the architecture, or do we first construct it and then we fertilize it, or should this go together? And some two short remarks, two short comments on what I heard, some reflections. Irina claimed there is an opinion, and Sophia also mentioned this, that our country is poor and our culture is under-financed. In the beginning, the moderator claimed that you could voice the calls for revolution. So maybe this is a stupid opinion, but anyway, I think if all of the cultural figures in Ukraine, or those that have some relation to culture, would buy this miner's hat and try to hit these miner's hats at the walls of the presidential administration, of the cabinet ministers, maybe once in 20 years, maybe this would change something. And actually, the second comment I have, so these cultural people, they only tend to sit down in their blog and quack like a frog and do nothing more. I'm sorry for saying this, I am entitled to say this. Maybe I should also buy this miner's hat and try to hit against the wall. But the second comment, well, I forgot the second comment. The most important thing is you called for revolution. Well, I would like, well, apart from your strict comments, my son would say this is awesome. You asked very smart questions, in professional terms, and I would like to answer to them, especially to the first question about the decline of the level and the attention and the intellect in terms of research. Your question is similar to Irina's question, but Irina was asking who do we need to create the exhibition, but your question is who is there to be the curator in the museums, who is designing them, being part of the museum. So last week one political scientist from Washington, we had a talk with him, and I was trying to explain to him that to work as a curator in an American museum, you must have the PhD in a specific area. What is more, when you are saying you are a historian, this is not the answer. you might be the master's degree or the PhD in history. This is not the answer. The next question would be, what kind of history are you majoring in? So we're talking about the interdisciplinary approach and aspect of museum operations. Well, actually, to make museums possible and to create museums, you must have the expert in a specific subject and this narrow history. But this is never going to work because a historian alone would not be able to do this. To be employed in an American museum, it is very difficult to get there. I know some specific experience because I don't work in Ukrainian museums, but it's very difficult. Well, I wouldn't like to falsify and make use of these facts, but as based on the specific experience I have, it's very difficult to be employed in the US Museum. And every label is a fight for wording. You cannot do this anyhow. If this is the Maya Civilization exhibition, this should be a person who is equally able to teach this in the university or be the curator in the museum. There is no lower expertise. This is a very high level of competence required. I understand that your question was about, well, you are taking a critical look on that. So I'm trying to tell you that it is considered to be quite a disadvantage if you have some failures like this. And the second question was about the concept of the museum. All of the things that I was showing to you, these were just the images, the pictures. But I was showing to the students the museum facilities that have been built to fit the concept of the museum. For example, the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. There is the museum. This is the only museum in the world, the Human Rights Museum. And the architect, when he was designing the building, he first had to be guided by the concept. You might check on the internet, all of that. So the concept of the museum would include the exhibition and the building itself. It is made in the form of the spiral and the candle of memory as the hope that goes to the heaven. And inside, a person would have to move along the so-called Labyrinth of Conscience. And this is very spectacular if you're inside there. And there is no way out. You have to make choices. And actually, it ends up on top with the Tower of Hope. So the architect was engaged into the design of the concept of this museum. Getting back to the Holocaust Museum, that I'm not sure whether it was mentioned or maybe you are going to talk about this in the future. The architect first had to go to the Auschwitz concentration camp before he even started doing anything. So he first needed to see and understand what it was about. His concept manages to render the terror of this physical sensation of what the person might feel. He used the same materials. He used the metal work, the illusion of the ovens. When you get into the Holocaust Museum, it's in the first place about the concept of what the museum is about. You don't want to stay there. You are taking to the specific hole, and there is nothing you can do or change about this. For me, it's a very difficult experience. You must take this road of horror and terror of the war when the entire world rejected to accept the Jews. There was this famous conference in Emergence in 1938 to declare that. And then you must enter the railway carriage brought from Poland. Well, the scale of this exhibition is huge. So you must enter this railway carriage. On the one hand, you see the suitcases and the purses and the notebooks. And then you leave and exit into the barrack. This is a very difficult experience, but this is the question about the design and concept. And the last point about the new Museum of the African American History in Washington. After many years of debate, in the public, it was opened. So the first thing you're doing, this is not the choice. The first thing you have to do is to go deep, like minus 5th level under the ground, and you are there under the ground. This is to start from selling the slaves from Africa. We all understand what slavery is, but everything has its roots behind it. The slavery starts when people sell so one African people sell the other African people, locals. So was it first the concept of the architect or the concept of the museum? It was all done together. So this is one of the cornerstones for creating new museums, not the old ones that have been there and now we are thinking what to do with them. Even though the old museums, very old museums, you asked about the old museums, what do we do about them to make them new? You can do many things about old museums, in fact. It's always the initiative of the creative spree of the people engaged in the project. For example, in Washington in the 1930s, there was this fundamental neoclassical building of the National Art Gallery. Who was visiting? It was just the picture gallery. But in the 1970s, where there was this flourishing of the new attitude to the museums, this museum decided, even though Washington is not most active axis of culture, so they decided it was time to build a new space, additional space for contemporary architecture. So when they were selecting the architect, it took a long time and they had different criteria, but it's a different story. But in the end, actually, they managed to find the architect, American architect of Chinese origin, Ipei, who created the masterpiece. The masterpiece, in addition to the space, the architectural solution included the huge piles of Alexander Calder that were supposed to be hung in there and be rotating. And these are very large in size, and they had to consider this exhibit when they designed the facility. At the same time, they needed to include the fountains with the triangular pyramids in between the two buildings, some sort of connection and continuation of history. First, there was this classic academic history and the contemporary history, contemporary art. So when Mitterrand looked at these small pyramids, he said, we wanted to have the same. And these pyramids have been replicated in the Louvre Museum. Of course, they are in a different size, but initially this was just the Palace of the Kings, Royal Palace, but anyway. In the beginning of July, I came back from the scholarship program of Line Kirkland, and I researched the Museum Bloom in Polish museums, as illustrated by the museum Warsaw Riot Museum, and I tried to analyze different concepts. So the Warsaw Protest Museum was created by museums, non-museum staff. It was only one historian on the team, but this is one of the most popular and most powerful museums both in Poland and abroad. But on the other hand, now there are competent museum workers working in the museum, and they're very important to understand how to run the museum operations. So we still have the discussions going on in the Ukrainian museum space. Museum is a sacred place. Let's enliven it with the help of different participatory projects. In the Polish museum environment, there is the reverse discussion, such as they are talking about the fact that the museum has been transformed into the shopping mall, and these extreme opinions actually make me think that there is a problem about awareness and education of museum staff and museum people, those who work in the museums. And I can see there's problems in Lviv museums as well, and libraries as well, because if the museum people and librarians were reading the proper books like Participatory Museums, where she claims that participatory projects are worthy of attention only when they are focusing on the mission and vision of the museum. So maybe then we wouldn't have this situation. We have some events in some of the libraries that doesn't make any sense. So we have this closest party just to engage the visitors. So this is some sort of distortion of understanding. So my first question to you: is the museum a sacred place or a form, and where is this golden mean? But in the process, I really liked your statement about smart museums, because actually we do lack smart museums, smart libraries. That's why I would like to know, what is your definition? What is a smart museum? Well, first of all, I'm surprised that somebody had read a book about participatory museums, because, well, this is the future that the museums are entering. I think, well, I tried to touch upon these aspects when I was answering the question of Sophia, that these kinds of museums are really oriented for a community, for the specific audience they wish to engage and to involve as participants. Talking about the temple and the forum, well, the golden mean, I suspect if you are the person reading these recent books, you probably know the statement of Duncan Cameron of what museums are. Is this a temple or a forum? And you probably remember his answer. He concluded with, it was his declaration that faced a lot of contradiction and insult among museum people, but nevertheless he actually only described what was happening already and predicted what we have today. He claimed that museums are the distance between the temple and the forum. We have not discussed this today. Each museum or different museums have very many facets. One museum would be made exclusively to make a declaration or a statement. It might be called a historical museum, a narrative museum, etc. But in fact, it could be the declaration museum, the political position statement. Another museum might be just a box keeping the treasures in. You just need to display them in the most interesting manner and in the smartest manner possible. This could be just the classroom, and they bring students there and they teach them to paint. This could be the concert hall, because contemporary museums do use their facilities for some performances and shows. Why not? Because initially museums were conceived as the place for many people to gather, to be able to experience some cultural waves together. At the same time, well, maybe it would be bad if we stop thinking about the museums as temples and they would be turned into the arcades. they're going to stop to be museums at that point. They should be educating and provoking, thought-provoking. I think that we hit all of the records with time. 2 last comments. You have 30 seconds each. Thank you for this great discussion on the lecture. And I wanted to summarize that all of these contemporary examples of high-tech architecture, these are just to illustrate a different type of rendering information. And what should all the dusty museums do? They just need to change the manner of communicating information. Me as a museum worker and a restorator, I always face in Ukrainian museums the situation when many exhibits are used as a tools for the ideas of the exhibition. The object, the exhibit, should be the main idea, and everything else should be evolving around this exhibit. All of the new additional stands. You don't need to have the millions of exhibits in the museums. You need to design the concept on the idea of the exhibition and change the way the information is communicated in. Thank you. Just a second. Your answer is very important. We have been discussing this for the entire week, that contemporary museums entered the 21st century from the exhibit-oriented concept to visitor-oriented concept. It's not even about the history, but about the person visiting a museum. If you take a look on what I put here on the slide, this is something we discussed with the students. Each of these important changes require a separate lecture, but when you talk about the exhibition developed around the exhibit, today it seems to be wrong, even though there is nothing better than the one exhibition. When there is one exhibit selected from the rich collection of the old dusty museum, and it is deeply analyzed and researched, and you develop the entire new world around this exhibit. When you start looking for the historical materials, there are newspapers, there are scandals, there are many personal things, so many materials, and you can develop a story around this exhibit. When a person gets to the exhibition of one exhibit, could learn many more things rather than passively passing along the rooms with many exhibits. The question about the trends, as far as I understand from the lecture, well, thank you for this lecture, that's beyond questioning. So I realized that the Jewish issues in the museum culture were actually started in order to break some taboos, the taboo topics. So my question is there a trend of some sort of making use or parasiting on the Jewish question, because it's used as a tool for, like, just magnet for tourists and to promote the little-known architects? If there is a trend like that, how dangerous it is, or maybe it's good? That's a great and very important question. Thank you for asking it. Well, this is something I was talking about to the students yesterday. Well, this ethical attitude to history should be above all. This is a very dangerous trend to exploit the topic of terror, especially today when a lot of topics of people that are only approximating the history, they realized that it's not only modern, but it's also a lot of benefits. Many foundations do fund the projects like this, and also this is very similar to the film production industry. If you want to get the Oscar, you should have a film about the Holocaust or something like this. But actually this is wrong to say to talk about the boom of Jewish museums. You should not be using the word like this. We do remember the times when you were prohibited to talk about that. Today we are allowed to talk about this. It's already very good. You are allowed, it is possible to talk about this, and the projects like this are supported. This is also very good. But the tolerant and the delicate attitude to this sensitive topic should be really focused on, and we should still continue these discussions. Thank you for your question. It implies you do understand everything about this. I think this is the best audience, very attentive and willing to continue the discussion I have ever seen. Thank you, Irina, for inviting us.